A millionaire loses a bet and marries a housemaid for 8 months. But when he brings her home as his wife, what happens next is something he never imagined. Ethan Caldwell was the kind of man who never knew defeat. At 42, he had built his reputation in Chicago as a ruthless real estate developer, the sort of figure who could make or break neighborhoods with the stroke of a pen. His penthouse on the edge of Lake Michigan looked down on the city like a throne room. To the world, Ethan represented success, confidence, and control. But to those who knew him well, his arrogance was often unbearable. He thrived on competition and enjoyed proving himself against anyone bold enough to doubt him. One autumn evening, the ballroom of a grand Chicago hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. The occasion was a charity gala, a space where business tycoons mingled with politicians, artists, and socialites. Ethan moved through the crowd like he owned it, exchanging smiles that never reached his eyes. At his side stood Ryan Turner, his closest friend and one of the few people bold enough to challenge him. Ryan, 40, was a high-powered lawyer whose wit was as sharp as his tailored suits. As the night wore on and the champagne flowed, the conversation between the two men grew more playful, edged with rivalry. "You've conquered skyscrapers, banks, half the city?" Ryan teased, his smirk mischievous. "But I wonder, Ethan, could you conquer something real? Something outside your glossy world?" Ethan arched an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" "A marriage," Ryan said flatly, letting the word hang in the air like a dare. Ethan laughed, the sound loud enough to draw a few glances. "Marriage? That's a game for sentimental fools, not men like me." Ryan leaned closer. "That's exactly my point. You surround yourself with glamorous women who admire your money and charm. But could you survive with someone different? Someone who doesn't care about your wealth?" Ethan's pride prickled. "Of course I could." Ryan's grin widened. "Then prove it. I bet you can't last in a marriage with such a woman for 8 months. No tricks, no loopholes. If you succeed, I'll pay you $10 million. The surrounding hum of conversation seemed to fade for Ethan. The amount was nothing he needed. His fortune far surpassed it, but the challenge itself lit a fire in his chest. $10 million wasn't money. It was a trophy. He straightened his tie and said smoothly, "I never turned down a bet." "Good," Ryan replied, clinking his glass against Ethan's. "Because I already have someone in mind." The days that followed were a blur of curiosity and planning. Ethan expected Ryan to find him some struggling model or eccentric artist. But when the details arrived, he was taken aback. The woman's name was Grace Monroe, a 35-year-old housemaid who worked at an estate on the north side of the city. Grace was independent, known for her strong will and quiet dignity. She wasn't glamorous, not the type of woman Ethan usually invited to his penthouse dinners or charity functions. When Ethan first saw her photograph, he chuckled to himself. A housemaid? Felt absurd. But his pride would not let him back down. A bet was a bet, and he intended to win. Their first meeting took place at an upscale restaurant, a favorite of Ethan's where waiters in pressed uniforms moved like clockwork. He arrived early, crisp in his tailored suit, prepared to charm her as he always did. When Grace entered, she carried herself with calm confidence. She wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, yet her presence commanded attention. She sat across from him, her eyes steady, her voice firm. "You must be Ethan Caldwell," she said, extending her hand. "And you must be Grace Monroe," Ethan replied with a smooth smile. She shook his hand briefly, her grip stronger than he expected. "Let's not play games. I know why we're here. I know about the bet." For a moment, Ethan's composure cracked, though he quickly recovered. "And yet you agreed to meet me." Grace's gaze didn't falter. "I have my reasons. But let's be clear. I won't be controlled. I won't be another one of your conquests. 8 months is 8 months, and when it's over, I walk away as I came." Ethan leaned back in his chair, intrigued despite himself. "You're confident." "I have to be," Grace answered. When the dinner ended, Ethan was unsettled. She hadn't been impressed by the luxurious setting or by him. Most people bent under his charm, But Grace hadn't given him the satisfaction. Instead of discouraging him, it sparked his competitive streak. A few days later, they met again, this time at a modest cafe Grace suggested. Ethan felt out of place among the chipped wooden tables and the smell of strong coffee, but he followed along. Grace was already there, sipping tea when he arrived. "I thought you preferred five-star restaurants," she teased lightly. "Sometimes it's good to break the routine," Ethan replied, though inside he felt the sting of being out of his element. They spoke for a while, covering surface-level topics until Grace leaned forward and set her cup down. "If we're really going through with this, there are rules. I don't want your money or your lifestyle. I'll keep my independence, my choices, and my freedom. If you think you can change that, you're mistaken." Ethan studied her carefully. Her tone was calm but unshakable. He found himself intrigued by her firmness. "Fine," he said finally. 8 months, and then we go our separate ways." Grace nodded, satisfied. For her, the agreement was clear. For Ethan, it was still a competition he intended to win. The wedding itself was nothing more than a formality, conducted quietly and without fanfare. Ethan's pride was satisfied with the bet, while Grace's determination anchored her resolve. He moved her into his lavish condo overlooking the lights of Chicago, confident she would eventually succumb to the comforts surrounding her. But from the very first night, Grace made her stance clear. Standing at the window, she looked out at the glittering skyline without admiration. 8 months, Ethan. Not a day more, she said firmly. Ethan smiled, unshaken. Resistance was nothing new. Every woman in his past had resisted at first, but eventually, they had all bent to his charm, his wealth, his influence. He was certain Grace would be no different. What he didn't realize was that this time, he was up against something far stronger than stubbornness. Grace had her own reasons, her own strength, and she wasn't here to play his game. The first days of their marriage unfolded like a silent battle. Ethan showered Grace with jewelry, designer clothes, and offers of luxury trips. Grace refused them all. She stuck to her modest habits, waking early, preparing her own meals, and maintaining the independence she had promised herself. "I don't need these things," she told him calmly when he presented her with a diamond necklace. Her words irritated him more than outright defiance. For the first time, Ethan felt his authority questioned not by rivals in business, but by someone inside his own home. And it bothered him deeply. In his mind, the bet had been simple. Endure the months, control the situation, claim victory. But Grace was proving to be a different kind of challenge. One he wasn't sure he knew how to win. And as the weeks moved forward, Ethan Caldwell, the man who had always believed he held the world in his hands, began to feel the first cracks in his control. The days after the wedding moved slowly, marked by a quiet tension that lingered in every room of Ethan Caldwell's penthouse. The walls, covered in expensive art, reflected the glow of Chicago's skyline each evening, but the grandeur seemed lost on Grace Monroe. She went about her routines as if the luxury around her didn't exist. Ethan tried to be patient at first, convinced her attitude was a mask she would eventually drop. He started with gifts, small at first, handbags, jewelry, fine perfumes. Grace rejected them with a polite but firm shake of her head. Then he escalated to trips, suggesting weekends in Paris or Cancun, complete with private jets and luxury suites. Grace didn't even hesitate before saying no. "I have no interest in living your kind of life," she said one morning, sipping her tea at the kitchen counter while Ethan held out a set of first-class tickets. Her calmness cut deeper than anger would have. Ethan wasn't used to calm rejection. In his world, money was the ultimate key, the solution to every problem, the way to win over every person. Grace seemed immune. "You really think you can last here without accepting anything I give you?" he asked one evening, frustration heavy in his tone. Grace looked up from the book she was reading. "I don't think it, Ethan. I know it. I didn't marry you for money, and I certainly won't be bought by it." The confidence in her voice unsettled him. He had dealt with competitors who threatened lawsuits, politicians who demanded compromises, bankers who pushed for impossible deals, but Grace was different. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. and yet her refusal carried more weight than any opposition he had ever faced. Ethan's pride wouldn't let him stop. He shifted tactics, deciding that if gifts didn't work, control might. He began interfering in her life, telling her she didn't need to work anymore. "Why bother cleaning houses?" he scoffed. "You're my wife now. You don't need a paycheck." But Grace disagreed. "Work is not about the paycheck," she said firmly. "It's about my independence. You may have agreed to this bet, Ethan, but I will not let you take away who I am." That night, Ethan stayed awake longer than usual, staring out at the city lights. He wasn't used to hearing no. Grace's words stirred something in him, though he couldn't place what it was. Irritation, maybe, or a strange sense of being challenged in ways he hadn't expected. Over time, the tension grew into open conflict. Ethan tried manipulating schedules, telling Grace he had arranged important dinners she was required to attend. When she insisted on keeping her own commitments, he deliberately delayed her, making her late just to remind her he was in charge. Grace never exploded in anger, but her sharp words during quiet dinners cut through his games. "I'm not one of your business deals," she told him. "You can't outmaneuver me the way you outmaneuver your rivals. If that's what you think, you'll be disappointed." Her resistance only fueled his determination. To him, this was no longer about $10 million, it was about pride. He needed to prove he was in control, even if Grace seemed to stand like a wall against every attempt. Then came the night that changed everything. Ethan had cornered her in the living room after another failed attempt to impress her with a gala invitation. His voice was sharper than usual, edged with frustration. "Why is it never enough, Grace? Any other woman would be grateful for what I'm offering." Grace finally set her glass down and met his eyes with an intensity that startled him. "Do you really want to know why, Ethan?" "Yes," he said, almost daring her. "You destroyed my family." Her words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Grace's voice didn't waver. "Years ago, one of your projects swallowed up my father's company. He ran a small contracting business. Honest work. We weren't wealthy, but we survived. Until you came along. You crushed him, Ethan, like he was nothing. He lost everything, our home, our security. And eventually he lost himself. He died, Ethan. My father died because of you." Ethan felt his chest tighten. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. His mind scrambled to remember, to search through the endless deals and takeovers that had built his empire. Faces, names, contracts, he couldn't recall them all. He had destroyed so many small businesses, so many lives, all in the name of profit. Grace's father could have been one of them, just another signature on a paper. He began, but Grace raised her hand sharply. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me you didn't know. That's the problem. You never cared to know. You've built a kingdom out of other people's ruin. And now, for once, you're the one forced to feel powerless." Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes blazed with anger. Ethan stood there frozen, every part of him shaken. For the first time, he saw his reflection in someone else's pain, and it terrified him. The days after her confession were like walking through a storm. Grace no longer argued or resisted outright, she did worse. She ignored him. At breakfast, she ate silently, her eyes fixed on her plate. In the evenings, she sat in the living room reading as if he wasn't there. Ethan tried to speak, but his words fell flat against the wall of her silence. The silence tormented him. He was used to being the center of attention, the man who commanded rooms and dictated outcomes. Now, in his own home, he was invisible. Grace treated him as if he were nothing more than a shadow. And it wasn't just at home. At work, Ethan began noticing things slipping out of his grasp. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. Projects he had carefully crafted began to falter. Colleagues whispered doubts about his leadership. Though Grace never admitted to interfering, Ethan felt her presence everywhere, as if she were pulling invisible strings around him. One evening, after another disastrous day at work, Ethan walked into the penthouse to find Grace sitting quietly with a cup of tea. He stood before her, his voice low, almost pleading. "You're tearing everything apart. aren't you?" Grace lifted her gaze, her face calm. "No, Ethan. I'm not destroying your life. I'm simply letting you feel the weight of what you've done. What you gave to others, I'm giving back to you." Ethan felt his strength falter. For the first time, he saw himself not as the victor, but as the pawn. Grace wasn't bending, she was leading, and he was the one following without control. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by Grace's words. The faces of the people he had wronged seemed to rise from the shadows. The pride that once fueled him now tasted bitter. By morning, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a bet anymore. He wasn't battling Grace for $10 million, or even for his pride. He was battling himself, and he was losing. The cracks in Ethan Caldwell's armor had finally begun to show, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if he had met his match. The days following Grace's revelation weighed heavily on Ethan Caldwell. For years, he had built his empire without hesitation, never looking back at the ruins he left behind. But now the cost of those choices stared at him each morning across the breakfast table. Grace's eyes, calm but unyielding, reflected everything he didn't want to face. He tried to reach her. He tried words, apologies, promises, but she cut them down with silence. At first, he thought the silence was anger. Then he realized it was worse. It was indifference. She didn't even see him as worthy of a response. The penthouse that once felt like his palace now seemed like a cage. Grace moved through it with quiet dignity, but never toward him. She prepared her tea, read her books, sat on the balcony at night staring at the city lights. Ethan hovered in the background, desperate for a sign that she noticed him. But her indifference was sharper than any insult. One evening, after pacing the living room for what felt like hours, he finally broke. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "we need to talk." She didn't look up from the book in her hands. "I know I've hurt people. I know what I did to your father was unforgivable. But please, tell me what I can do. I can't stand this anymore." Grace slowly closed the book and placed it on the table. She looked at him then, her eyes colder than winter air. "You think there's something you can do now that will erase years of pain? You think money or words will bring back the man who raised me? Or the life I lost because of you?" Ethan stepped closer, his desperation spilling out. "I can change, Grace. I can make it right." "No," she interrupted sharply, rising to her feet. "You can't make it right. You can't fix what you destroyed. You will carry this, Ethan, for the rest of your life. That's your punishment. Not my anger, not my revenge. Your guilt. And it will eat at you every single day." Her words landed like stones in his chest. He sank into silence, realizing she meant every word. The following days blurred into routine. Grace ignored him as always, but now Ethan no longer tried to fight her silence with force. Instead, he began to watch. He noticed things he hadn't before. The way she liked her coffee strong with no sugar, the way she paused at flower stalls whenever they walked past one, her quiet preference for lilies. One morning, while she went for a walk, he placed a bouquet of lilies on the kitchen table. He didn't leave a note, didn't wait for her reaction. He sat in his office, pretending to read documents, when he heard the faint sound of her footsteps returning. The silence stretched. Then he heard the faintest rustle of petals. Later, when he walked into the kitchen, the flowers were in a vase by the window. Grace didn't say a word about them, but she hadn't thrown them away either. That small detail gave him hope. The next days, he repeated the quiet gestures. He prepared her tea the way she liked it and left it waiting on the counter each morning. He made sure the pantry had the foods she preferred. He didn't force conversation, didn't press her for forgiveness. For the first time in his life, Ethan acted without expecting instant reward. Grace noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. Her silence wasn't quite as sharp as before. One night, the air outside was biting cold. Grace stood on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, staring at the skyline. Ethan hesitated by the door, then brought her a cup of hot tea. "I thought you might want something warm," he said, his voice gentle. Grace accepted it without looking at him. They stood in silence for a long while, the city below glittering like a sea of stars. Finally, she spoke. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every word. "Because I finally understand. My words mean nothing. Apologies won't bring back what I destroyed. But I can show you I've changed. Not for the bet. Not for the money. For me. For you." Grace turned her head slightly, studying him. The hardness in her eyes softened just a fraction. "You can't change the past." "I know," he said quietly. "But I can change the future." For the first time in weeks, her silence wasn't unbearable. Felt like a small opening, a chance. From that night on, the walls between them began to weaken. Grace still kept her distance, but she no longer brushed off every gesture. She allowed him to sit with her during breakfast, though their conversation was limited to simple remarks. She accepted the tea he offered in the evenings. To Ethan, those small changes felt monumental. But the real test came unexpectedly. One evening, as Ethan prepared to leave for an important meeting with investors, Grace walked into the room. Her face was unreadable. "Can you cancel your meeting?" she asked. Ethan froze. Grace had never before shown the slightest interest in his comings and goings. "Cancel? This is—" He stopped himself, then nodded. He pulled out his phone, called his assistant, and canceled without hesitation. When he sat back down, Grace gave the faintest nod, as if confirming something she had suspected. They sat together in the living room, a small space between them on the couch. The silence wasn't cold this time. It felt cautious, like two people standing at the edge of something new. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Grace said at last, her voice calm. "But I see that you're trying. And maybe that means something." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't push further. He only nodded, grateful for the sliver of hope her words carried. Still, Grace's guardedness never completely lifted. Some nights she seemed almost distant again, lost in thought, her eyes carrying a shadow Ethan couldn't decipher. He knew there was more she hadn't told him, something buried deeper than the loss of her father. One rainy evening, when the sound of droplets tapping against the glass filled the penthouse, Ethan finally asked, "Grace, is there something else? Something you haven't said?" She sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she whispered, "There is." Ethan leaned forward, his voice almost trembling. "Please, I need to know." Grace lifted her eyes, and he saw pain there unlike anything she had revealed before. "When everything collapsed, when my father lost the business, when I lost him, I was pregnant." Ethan's world tilted. He stared at her, his breath caught in his throat. "The stress, the fear, the loss," she continued, her voice breaking. "I lost the baby, Ethan, my child, because of everything you caused." Her words slammed into him like a blow. Ethan staggered back, his body heavy with guilt. He thought the worst truth had already been revealed, but this was worse than he could have imagined. A life that could have been snuffed out because of his greed. His voice cracked. "Grace, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "No," she said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "You didn't know because you never cared to know. You never looked at the people you destroyed. You only looked at the prize." Ethan dropped to his knees before her, unable to hold himself upright. "I don't have words. I don't deserve forgiveness. But please let me try to be different. Let me change. Not for me, not for money, for you. For the life you lost." Grace turned her face away, wiping her tears. Her voice was low but steady. "Change if you want to, Ethan. But don't do it for me. Do it because it's the only way you can live with yourself." That night, Ethan lay awake until dawn. Her revelation consumed him. He knew then that redemption wouldn't come through gestures alone. It would require something more, something he had never done before: accountability. The next morning, he made his choice. He wouldn't just speak of change, he would act. He would face the people he had wronged one by one. He would try to rebuild what he had broken. Grace didn't know it yet, but Ethan Caldwell had taken his first step into a journey he had never expected to walk: the path of true redemption. The morning after Grace confessed the truth about losing her child, Ethan Caldwell woke with a heaviness in his chest unlike anything he had felt before. He had built skyscrapers, moved entire blocks of Chicago to fit his vision, and collected more wealth than he could ever spend. Yet in that moment he realized how hollow it all was. He couldn't erase the pain he had caused. He couldn't bring back her father. He couldn't undo the loss of her baby. But he could change who he was going forward. For the first time in years, Ethan canceled his business meetings. He sat at his desk and wrote a list, not of numbers or deals, but of names. Companies he had crushed, families whose small businesses had collapsed under the weight of his empire. He knew he couldn't reach everyone, but he would try. His first visit was to a modest neighborhood on the city's west side. The house was small, the paint peeling, but it was full of life. A man in his 60s opened the door, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Ethan Caldwell on his porch. "I know who you are," the man said, his voice bitter. "I know you do," Ethan replied quietly. "I'm not here to defend myself. I came to apologize." The man laughed, the sound sharp. "Apologize? After all these years? After everything you took?" "I can't change the past," Ethan said, meeting his gaze. "But I can help rebuild the future. If you'll let me." The man didn't slam the door. He didn't forgive either. But he listened, and that was enough for Ethan to keep going. Over the next weeks, he visited more families, more small businesses. Sometimes he was cursed at, sometimes doors were slammed in his face. But other times, people listened. He didn't just offer money, though he gave plenty, he offered his time. He worked with local charities to create recovery programs for small entrepreneurs, setting aside millions to help rebuild what he had once destroyed. At home, Grace noticed the change. She watched from a distance, skeptical at first. She had heard Ethan's promises before, but this was different. He came home tired, his expensive suits replaced by rolled-up sleeves. He no longer bragged about his empire or his power. He spoke about the people he had met, the stories he had heard, the weight of their anger and their pain. One evening, she found him sitting quietly on the balcony, staring out at Lake Michigan. His eyes were tired, but there was a new calm in them. "How was it today?" she asked softly. "Tough," he admitted, "but necessary. Every conversation reminds me of who I was, and who I don't want to be anymore." Grace studied him, her heart conflicted. The anger she had carried for so long was still there, but so was something new. A flicker of respect she hadn't expected to feel. Slowly, the ice between them began to melt. Grace still guarded her heart, but she no longer looked at Ethan with the same disdain. She joined him at dinner, asked about his visits, even smiled once or twice at his stories. For Ethan, those small moments were victories greater than any deal he had ever closed. As the 8th month of their marriage approached, Ethan realized he no longer cared about the bet. The $10 million meant nothing. What mattered was Grace. Her trust, her dignity, her forgiveness. One evening, over a quiet dinner, he finally spoke the words that had been weighing on him. "Grace," he said, his voice steady, "I know this marriage started as a game, a bet, but somewhere along the way it stopped being that. I've fallen in love with you, truly, and I don't want this to end." Grace looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said softly, "Love isn't about control or money, Ethan. It's about respect. It's about seeing the other person as equal." "I know," Ethan whispered, "and I want to build that with you. Not as the man I was, but as the man I'm trying to become." Grace's eyes softened, though her voice remained cautious. "I can't promise forgiveness overnight, but I see the change in you, and maybe that's a start." A few weeks later, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her with a wave of emotions: fear, hope, and a cautious kind of joy. When she told Ethan, his reaction was immediate and unrestrained. He wrapped her in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "This time," he said through tears, "I'll do it right. I'll be the man you and our child deserve." Grace held him close, her heart finally beginning to trust that maybe he meant it. Ethan wasted no time. He arranged a new wedding, not a cold ceremony built on pride, but an intimate celebration with only a few close friends. No glittering chandeliers, no business deals whispered in the corners. Just him and Grace, standing side by side, ready to start again. As they danced slowly at the end of the night, Grace rested her head against his chest. "Who would have thought," she whispered, "that it all started with a bet?" Ethan smiled, holding her tighter. "The best bet I ever made." For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell wasn't thinking about control, money, or victory. He was thinking about redemption, about love built on equality and dignity, about a future he had once believed impossible. And for Grace Monroe, the woman who had once vowed to walk away, there was finally a reason to stay.